Hello, everyone. Welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. We're recording this on the 1st of July. No, it's not. It's the 1st of June. Getting ahead of myself. I'm joined, as usual, by George Hoare. Hi, George.
Hi from London.
And indeed, hi from London from me too, which is exciting. We're not even in the same room, though. We couldn't even organize that, which says something about the organizational capacities of the left, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyway, Phil is away. I'm not sure where he is, but he's not here. But we do have not a Phil replacement, but we do have a guest, which actually we should have had on already a very long time ago. I've been a big fan of what he tweets at Daily Barbarian. It is Geoff Shullenberger, who teaches at NYU, is a columnist at Compact, and also has a podcast called Outsider Theory, which also has very frequent, interesting guests and conversations, and it's worth checking out. If you were ever, listener, to listen to a podcast other than BungaCast, that might be an idea. But you don't have to listen to other podcasts. You can just stay right here. Geoff, it's great to have you.
Thanks. Long time, first time, as they say.
Excellent. We want to discuss a couple of different issues, in some ways hinged on two pieces that you've written relatively recently. Maybe you actually wrote them a very long time ago, but at least they came out in the recent months. One is a piece in American Affairs about how we forgot Foucault. The other is a piece in the New Atlantis, the crisis of the crisis. And so obviously these things refer to questions of the pandemic, biopower, social control, and so on, as well as emergency politics. And listeners who've been following us and who've been following our reading club syllabus for 2022 will maybe identify certain similar themes there. We've started the first 6 months of the year dedicated to the theme of emergency politics and control. So we've been reading some classic texts on that and some newer texts indeed on the politics of fear. And so this will be a good opportunity to kind of continue that discussion that we're having and kind of, develop the theme. Most recently, specifically, we actually discussed The Birth of Biopolitics, which is a series of lectures Michel Foucault gave in France in the late 70s. And we disagreed amongst the three of us. Phil, unfortunately, can't be here to speak for himself. But anyway, about exactly how useful the idea of biopolitics is, the extent to which it's relevant today, to the extent to which it's a recipe. Anyway, so maybe to get started, if you could explain, Geoff, what your basic argument is. And the basic argument, I'm asking you it, but I'm also going to tell people the very, very basic idea, which is one that lots of people have made before. Phil has been making this point for quite a while, actually, since the early days of the pandemic, which is basically that the right has adopted Foucault and the left has abandoned it after having used biopolitics for quite a while as a critical tool. So maybe take us from there.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, it's curious. What I start with in the American Affairs piece is that, even as I was writing it, there was still all of this kind of, there were these new ways. So Foucault is the bête noire of the right, of the center left kind of classical liberal types for quite a while. They see him as, one of these sources of a kind of corrosive, like postmodern relativism. So even as I was writing this, there were all of these new waves of kind of hostility to Foucault being unleashed on the right, most notably that this other French intellectual of the same sort of generation, Guy Sormon, who is basically a conservative, but sort of was in some of the same circles as Foucault decades ago, and made this claim about him engaging in pedophilia while he was living in Tunisia in the late 60s. So in any case, the right is still, I wouldn't overstate the sort of the right embracing Foucault per se, because they're still plenty hostile to him. But, there has been this general way that the themes of Foucauldian critique have sort of surfaced in ways, both explicit and implicit in the kind of right-wing response to the pandemic. And I think, before I got to this, the person who explored this in considerable depth and in a very cogent way was Blake Smith, who has a series of articles on this subject. And he also has an interesting article that I think came out after mine that's something about like how conservatives became the new queers or the new gays or something like that. And he basically compares this kind of, during the AIDS crisis, the way that there was this kind of rebellion against the sort of the fear, rebellion against the kind of fear that was circulating and being imposed, and the kind of controls that came with it, in the form of essentially continuing to engage in risky sexual activities regardless. And so he kind of points out how kind of the conservative thumbing their nose at pandemic controls and this kind of this kind of pleasure in this like hedonistic revolt against this
transgression
new regime. So I mean, this also, it fits into this longer, you've had Angela Nagel on here before. She's someone I've spoken to a number of times, and this longer kind of head of conservatives embracing transgression, and not necessarily directly through kind of Foucault's account of it, but just through a kind of embrace of the cultural politics of transgression. So I think there's a way that sets up some of the response to the pandemic. But then there's also a way that I think, you see a lot of these kind of just middle American people who are, in these kind of exurbs and, wouldn't have necessarily been paying attention to like, Milo Yiannopoulos or that kind of era of right-wing transgression, but who are kind of, when confronted with the pandemic, are kind of embracing the spirit of transgressive, again, kind of thumbing their noses at this new regime of control, right? And so, so there's an interesting theme here, which doesn't necessarily have to do with the right overtly saying, we now think Foucault was right, but kind of picking up on the spirit of, he was somebody who was in like the Bay Area in the 80s, seems to have contracted HIV there, and that was what led to his death, right? So, that they're kind of picking up on the spirit of transgression that he sort of celebrated and was part of. And then at the same time, in a sort of incipient way, they're trying to figure out what this form of power is that they're having to contend with, right? Which seems, it takes the form of, for example, public health authorities, essentially, in their view, sort of hijacking the government and, imposing these new controls by fiat without any kind of, normal procedural process, and that this is happening both on local and national levels, and so they're trying to, and so I think the fact that the right has in various ways gotten interested in trying to theorize like the managerial, has kind of returned to figures like James Burnham and trying to figure out like what is this managerial class, what is this bureaucracy that seems to exert power in a way that can kind of override what we might have taken to be the kind of, will of the people. And so Foucault himself is kind of interested in this as well, right? And he does, trace back to the period of the French Revolution, a kind of concern about the emergence of sort of, the first modern public health authorities.
Sorry, Geoff, just before kind of going into Foucault himself, I mean, I just think this idea of like conservatives embracing transgression, which is, as you said, probably part, Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel is one of the earliest kind of recognitions that this is happening. I mean, do you think it's like, I guess my question is, what do you think is the bigger thing that needs explaining, sort of why the right have taken up Foucault or why the left kind of dropped him? Is it too simple to say that the left, like, to generalize, and if you can even talk of the left and all that sort of thing, but like that the left turned away from transgression, and that in the COVID period it was kind of conformity rather than transgression that was the on the left's banners?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this sort of relates to a broader argument I make about, so part of what's interesting about Foucault, and has been interesting to me for a while pre-pandemic, was the way that his a certain version of his thinking became, incredibly dominant in the academic humanities, at least in the U.S.
Massively.
And that was very evident, when I was in graduate school and so on. And even again, prior to this, I found it interesting that, one point that he, is famous for is just this kind of idea of power as this kind of diffuse force, right? That, is operating at every level, right? And so, I suppose maybe my earliest theorization of like the left, at least left academia's relationship to Foucault, was that it had less to do with being particularly transgressive and more to do with this idea that, through this kind of, essentially competitive professional activity, you could still be engaging in a kind of politics. So that if power is operative at every level, then, that means when you go to an academic conference and deliver a paper, you're on some level engaging in a potentially subversive act or engaging in resistance, occupying a site of resistance or something like that. So it sort of threads the needle between, keeping up with the kind of, the spirit of 68 and this kind of, new left, animating set of kind of broadly left principles, but at the same time, this kind of complete absorption into this, hyper competitive and highly professionalized setting. So that was kind of how I thought of it then. Yeah.
No, so it's interesting. I mean, it's funny because a lot of the Foucauldian approach could be summed up, rather crudely as, denuding the institutions of their sense of neutrality and independence, right? And I think actually you put it more or less that way in the piece, which is a little bit ironic, especially for the academic left, for whom, institutionality, certainly in terms of being wedded to the academy, but also in certain cases, wedded to the judiciary, maybe to institutions of the press and other ones, which are effectively, classic institutions that the professional managerial class, but the middle class more generally has defended, certainly kind of more urban middle classes, and defended the professional values inherent in those and so on. So there's already an obvious point of tension there, I think. They're saying, hey, we're Foucauldians and institutions aren't neutral, but actually all the ones that we believe in, we believe in their neutrality and their independence. So I think that there's something like already sort of paradoxical there. Maybe what we're seeing now is a kind of smoothing out of that contradiction, right? That they are abandoning these more radical Foucauldian notions and just going, no, maybe institutions can be independent and neutral, and then we should just back them. Effectively a nakedly conservative turn.
Yeah, right. I think it's so in one sense it becomes a kind of a way of kind of mythologizing their own kind of professional activity and status, which in effect ends up being so on one hand, it's a sort of it becomes a kind of conservative ideology in that it provides a kind of rationale for, operating within this system. But at the same time, it also enables, and this is something else I've written about, that, the way that a sort of transgressiveness manifests itself in these kind of settings is that, like, in a lot of these fields now, and this has been the case for a while, but I think it's been escalating. The way that you relate is to basically propose like abolishing the field that you're actually a professor of. Right. We have there's a major case of this in classics, a major case of this in anthropology, where essentially these people are the rising stars in the field. What they're saying is that, and these are people who've gone through the entire process of professional formation very successfully, but then what kind of really gives them the spotlight is to say that, like, this field in which I've made my career is irrecuperably racist, white supremacist, etc., and therefore needs to be dismantled, right?
Yeah,
and so I think that
it can be pitched as quite brave as well. Like, wow, just really speaking truth to power. But anyway,
yeah. So I think it's of a piece with this kind of this sort of paradoxical sensibility where on one hand, the people who occupy these positions paradoxically kind of thrive in them precisely by positioning themselves as kind of subversive insiders who are going to in some way revolutionize it, while of course, still continuing to kind of draw their paychecks and so on. So I don't know. I mean, I think, you guys have had Catherine Liu, on a number of times. I mean, she sort of discusses this in terms of like this kind of, that the values, she seems to argue that there are sort of, positive values of the professional classes that, come from an earlier period, but that those have largely been abandoned in favor of this kind of opportunistic nihilism.
I think that's probably clearest with regard to free speech, actually, as a matter, I think that it's the most pointed and most fundamental element where a lot of the professional managerial class has no real concern for free speech. They might for privacy in certain instances, but even there, it's maybe not a consistent defense of privacy. But certainly with free speech, it's like an area where it's like, well, that's not something that matters to us, and it's other people who are just going to abuse this right, and therefore we need to enforce right thought, and that's probably the most clear change in the middle, I think, in the kind of professional middle class, which used to be a pretty strong defender of free speech.
Sorry, just to clarify, Geoff, is your take or your analysis of this basically that the professional managerial class as a whole is prepared to sell out the conditions of its own authority ultimately, like anything around the knowledge that it produces, and that this, I mean, would you extend this and say this is ultimately a kind of, I guess it's, and to a certain extent, it's like the sign of a group or a social situation that's in decline, because you realize it's not going to be continuing anymore. So you've just got to kind of make your like what you can before this whole edifice collapses. I mean, is this your take, that it's a group of people who are prepared to sort of say whatever you would give me the social authority, I'm prepared to sell that out just to get further within the game that I'm playing at this point in time?
Yeah, I mean, I think at least narrowly within the setting of the academic humanities,
right,
which is in radical decline as a profession in every sort of regard, I think that's about right. I mean, more broadly, I think it also connects to the way that emergency politics becomes the kind of only means by which institutions legitimate themselves, kind of at every level. And so, this is kind of a version of that, right? Saying that, your own field, your own sort of, specialized field in the academy is itself, plunged into the state of emergency by its sort of inherent white supremacy, et cetera. And therefore, I mean, in effect, what's needed is for some heroic, moral agent to step up and, reorient it in a new way. So, I mean, I think it also just fits in with the broader way that kind of emergency politics seem to be kind of endemic on all levels.
Yeah. I do want to come back. I want to come back to that, like, specifically, and we can spend a bit of time on that. I just want to do a bit of sidebar on the question of transgression before we kind of move on, because we can sometimes look nostalgically at previous lefts and, kind of the new left spirit of rebellion, or indeed maybe look enviously at some of the contemporary right, populist right, or whatever it might be called, and think like, oh, well, they're really sticking it to the man, and the left now has become so compliant, and it's over COVID, that's a good example. But I mean, and ultimately what's behind that kind of transgression is an element of enjoyment or jouissance, and that effectively it's not just simple pleasure, it's pleasure that is obtained in some way by transgressing a limit or tarrying in some way with limits. So it can be masochistic enjoyment can be part of that as well, for that matter. And my general rule on politics is, if it feels good, don't do it. Or alternatively, if it doesn't feel good, do it. Which it's basically to say that politics is about discipline and not necessarily about jouissance. And the desire for a kind of rebellious left, okay, I mean, obviously rebellion is important, and any kind of movement seeking an alternative to the current order, right? To put it in the most basic terms. But at the same time, and compliance isn't good, but I think there's something else to be found between those two poles of rebellion and transgression and the pleasure you obtain from that, and compliance, which also actually has perhaps its own element of like jouissance, right? That it's like I'm enforcing the rules, I'm enforcing them on myself, I'm enforcing them on the other. You're pushing things to such a limit of compliance that you derive some almost a sort of masochistic and sadistic pleasure from that. And so I don't think that's good either. I think, again, if it feels good, don't do it. And that's the rule for politics.
Yeah, I mean, here I think I wrote something recently for Unheard about the sort of 2-year anniversary of George Floyd, and I think there you have another interesting example where, I mean, I know anecdotally from talking to people that, part of what was going on clearly in those weeks was, people were simply having the opportunity to go outside and be around other people, but also have a moral legitimation for that, right? So, in other words, there was an element of simply feeling good, right? Straightforwardly, that a lot of people who participated in that felt. And I mean, I know this because I've talked to friends and acquaintances who have reported that was exactly their experience, like here in New York in those months. But, I think what we see there is, okay, so we did have a kind of rebellion, right? We saw something, an immense number of people, was also immensely destructive, right? It actually did have, a remarkable sort of footprint in terms of what it did in various kind of urban landscapes. And yet, it, as far as I can tell, the main thing that did was kind of, add a sort of oomph to the Biden campaign that, helped kind of reconsolidate this, this kind of revolving door, DNC politics. So, and that's not, I don't necessarily look at this conspiratorially. I mean, I think it is interesting that, like, as that, Time magazine piece sort of, reported on in a positive, in a positive light, basically the leaders of a lot of these protests are actually coordinating directly with, various Democratic Party staffers, as well as, unions and NGOs, and, that there was kind of this, there was a kind of coordinated push, right? And that's, that was told to us in this Time magazine article, which, was presenting it as this, great positive thing that everybody had come together to get rid of the bad orange man. But, so I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, I mean, we've seen something that, checked all the boxes of a kind of rebellion or a kind of, I mean, even, I'd say transgressive sort of rebellion that seemed to kind of summon up the spirit of '68 and all of that. And yet, there's no real sense in which it, was at odds with the agenda of, like, the main people funding the Biden campaign.
So you could call it a sort of conformist rebellion, perhaps, used the title of a recent collection, because I mean, and this I guess does relate to your point, Alex, about, if it feels good, don't do it, because there can be a superficial like feeling of jouissance or whatever the English for that would be if you're kind of rebelling. But actually, I guess the question of whether this is or how this is connected to interests of various groups is if you treat that as secondary, you're going to end up with a lot of manufactured dissent and conformist rebellions, because it's about how it feels and how it looks, rather than really what political changes or lack of it's going to be causing.
No, and it's evident that it's completely implicated with a rejection of authority, right? So it's not seizing authority for itself, whatever movement kind of engages in this transgression, because it assumes or builds up this kind of big authority which you're rebelling against, with the assumption somehow that it'll still be there tomorrow, So it's not saying, okay, actually there is no authority and we're seizing it for ourselves. It kind of reifies that authority, and that's what's probably, I think that would be the middle way, as it were, between transgressive rebellion and compliance, which itself would be in some ways transgressive or provide some enjoyment, would be the kind of seizing of authority for oneself, and that demands responsibility. And it's not a lot of fun, because what you are generally trying to do in life is to avoid responsibility, because we all do it, right? You don't want to say I'll be responsible for this, but that's important. So I think that's kind of the key there.
And I mean, we might go back to January 6th as well, because, there we saw something that was kind of at least aesthetically, a much more convincingly kind of countercultural, kind of transgressive political act. Yet again, it was, it was also interesting to see I think the obviously we know what the predominant left response to it was. There's a putsch or whatever, fascist coup. But then I think there was a more subtle one, which was basically, I wish we could sort of have the chutzpah to do something like that. So I think there was kind of a certain amount of envy, at least in certain quadrants of the left. And I mean, I spoke to, friends with the sort of anarchist background who definitely felt this. But again, I mean, and I actually spoke to Angela, pretty soon after that, and we sort of talked about it in terms of this, her whole account of the kind of rise of transgression on the right. And I think in a sense the complete sort of hollowness political project it represented was what ultimately came out of it. Now, I mean, on the other hand, I was kind of interested, because we're talking about state of exception, but we could leave this to another point in the discussion if you want. But I mean, I think this project of that's still ongoing of John Eastman, right, who is the main lawyer trying to essentially overturn the election results, is quite interesting as a somewhat more substantive, if kind of insane, sort of right-wing project that I think goes beyond the kind of purely gestural subversion. Again, I'm not, this isn't an endorsement, but it is another interesting manifestation of this kind of a version of emergency politics that's coming out of the right that I think is both kind of batshit, but also has a little bit more substance to it than some of these kind of transgressive displays.
Yeah, that makes me think, because obviously there's a lot of this in Brazil, constant talk of Bolsonaro attempting to do the same thing, of stealing the election or refusing to step down. But it's obviously in a context which is far more, the institutions are far more precarious, right? So it's not like there's a dictatorship in living memory. So it's more complicated. And I think one of to kind of double back to Foucault, because I'm now started talking about Brazil, but this reminds me, and it's sort of a bridge between the things, is that there's and I wonder whether it applies to the American right, is what I'm getting towards. There's an interesting argument made by a Brazilian theorist that Bolsonaro's appeal is actually Foucauldian, or rather he reads it through a Foucauldian lens. So it's not class domination explicitly, but rather it is the kind of petty power of a man, a husband over his wife, of the foreman over his workers, of the president over the populace, the successful person over the unsuccessful person, but perhaps of the same class, and that is the appeal there, and that there is a libidinal pleasure in saying, no, actually, all these restraints, and whether moral or legal, on your action should be reeled away. So you, the kind of artisanal miner, I don't mean artisanal in the sense of it being kind of hipster, I just mean like freelance gold miner in the Amazon, is able to go out and dominate and steal territory of the Indians. And it's like, well, screw the Indians and screw the regulations and screw what morality says, you shouldn't do. You're allowed to do it, right? I wonder whether there's a similar thing at play, because I found it a very convincing argument of Bolsonaro's appeal, and also his cross-class appeal, because although he doesn't have support amongst women, and he doesn't have support amongst the Black, majority of Brazilians. But every other group, you find support for him. So it is kind of cross-class. And that's an important element, I think, in explaining it. So anyway, I was curious whether you think that argument would apply maybe to the American right.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think in some sense, the American right, has, again, this kind of goes back to the point about the sort of increasing, return to particularly James Burnham and his account of the managerial elite, and the way that they've, I mean, in a much more, it's not to say that there weren't elements of this before, but they've come to kind of identify the sort of main, the kind of locus of political struggle as being against certain institutions and those who operate in them, right? And particularly, basically the kind of realms of the government that are staffed by unelected bureaucrats, right? And this is, I mean, it is a sort of interesting development that become so much more pronounced now. I mean, part of what's kind of interesting and ambiguous about this is that that the expansion of that realm has been, has taken place under both that realm of kind of state bureaucracy has taken place under both Democratic and Republican presidents,
and it's a security apparatus as much as it is the medical establishment, or things that the left likes or things that the right likes.
Right. And then you had you had the left sort of embrace the national security agencies, the various intelligence agencies, the FBI, as sort of allies in the resistance, during the Trump years. And so I think in that sense, yeah, there's an obvious way that a certain kind of a kind of personalistic model of power is at least intuitively and sort of emotionally appealing to a movement that largely sees itself as a war with these kind of hidden realms of bureaucracy that where power operates in these highly opaque ways. Now, I mean, something that's kind of interesting here that your remarks reminded me of is that if you read Benjamin Bratton's, I think George interviewed Bratton on here, but if you read his book, Revenge of the Real, it essentially just kind of reverses the terms of this, because it basically sees right-wing populism as this kind of reversion to, and he's, his framework is entirely Foucauldian, so he's a leftist who did not forget Foucault and is in fact kind of repurposing biopolitics as a positive project, as he puts it. But basically he sees, right-wing populism as this kind of reversion to the logic of this more kind of archaic mode of governance of power that is, that Foucault identifies with sovereignty, right? Which then, Foucault argues kind of wanes and is replaced by this this new, kind of more diffuse mode of power that he identifies with biopolitics. So for Bratton, really, the point is to be on the side of biopolitics, because the alternative is this kind of regression to a sort of personalistic model of sovereignty, right? Which is what he claims all right populism is. So it's interesting to see him kind of articulate a similar opposition to what you see on the right, but in a way that basically embraces the sort of managerial state as the necessary mode of exercising power.
I think I know that the episode with Benjamin Bratton wasn't necessarily the most popular one that we've done amongst our listeners, but I think it's an important book or an important position, not one that I happen to have all that much sympathy with, let's put it that way. But I think in terms of the drawing out the implications of Foucauldian thought and then staking out a political position, as you said, Geoff, the phrase positive biopolitics, that's the summary. I think that is an extremely I think, been proved to be correct on this, has been really important element of left thinking in the past couple of years, and one that there are many reasons why it can continue to be quite influential even post kind of COVID emergency, because I think there's going to be a whole load of kind of changes that we'll see in the next few years coming off the back of that. And yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that basically the people who, as far as I sort of read it, who really stuck true to their Foucauldian origins were Bratton, Agamben, who was much less popular than Benjamin Bratton on the left, and there aren't that many more. Like, it was weird because you might have sort of seen some critiques of Foucault coming in the COVID period, but it was mostly just ignoring, except for or maybe it was kind of displaced onto Agamben and saying that Agamben's terrible, and then you don't have to deal with Foucault. You can sort of deal with the quote unquote distortion of his thought in Agamben. But yeah, just wanted to stick in a defense of my choice to interview Benjamin Bratton on the podcast, because listeners were not did not seem to agree with me that it was an important conversation to have.
Always good to subtly attack the audience in a very gentle way, but
yeah.
But I agree with that. I think, it's a useful book, if nothing else, because I think it articulates things that, we're kind of implicitly accepted across much of the left, but we're never really argued for. And so it does at least give you something to, because I mean, part of what's frustrating about a lot of these conversations around COVID is that they often amount to a kind of refusal to even discuss. And, that there's very much this kind of, and something I'm kind of interested in, which, ties into all of this, although it might be too big of a can of worms to open, but, kind of the relationship between neoliberalism and biopolitics, which is, of course, central to Foucault's Birth of Biopolitics lectures. But, there is this kind of, there is no alternative kind of attitude that arose, where you essentially couldn't, it was anathema to even bring any even mild criticisms to a lot of the stuff. And so I think Bratton is helpful in that he does at least articulate an argument that you can engage with, rather than just a kind of cutting off of debate in the name of saving lives or whatever.
But I mean, I guess what's very absent in this opposition between the position Bratton represents and the position that some of the right represents, in terms of wanting, this charismatic authority of the president to, basically enact sovereignty through its own acts of exception, right? We don't need to follow the rules. Let's just get stuff done. Is the whole concept of democratic authority, is the concept even of real state capacity, which gets ignored in all of this, which is a big element in the I think, at least that's my take, in the response to the pandemic, that it was the absence of state capacity which led them to impose lockdowns, for example, because they didn't have a way to keep business running as normal as possible while also protecting the vulnerable. And so you end up with this opposition between the liberal defense of institutions, and especially of unelected bureaucrats and their ability to manage life, and the rights opposition, which is also not democratic. And so that opposition brings me on, at least, to the question also. Oh, sorry. I was just going to finish the question of competing emergency politics, because that seems to be what structures the political spectrum today, such as it is, and it's terrible. And it's gonna, and I don't see it improving.
Right, and I mean, this also brings me to you raised the question earlier of like, how useful is biopolitics as a concept, or biopolitics or biopower as a sort of analytical concept. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what your different positions were on it. I think it's somewhat useful, but also, I mean, here's one way of thinking about it, which I was actually in a conference, an online conference a couple of weeks ago, which was, I think, the first kind of, discussion among academics I've had that, broached a lot of these more critical perspectives. And, I'm also going to another such, which is coming up shortly. So it does seem like there's a little bit of an opening up about being able to discuss these things. But at that conference, one critique of the mode of biopolitics was just that it's not specific enough particularly when you want to try to make sense of something like what's been going on in the past 2.5 years, it becomes a kind of easy shorthand for, this particular mode of emergency politics that you have criticisms of. But, in reality, the concept is a lot broader, right? And so, one way to think about this would be, we had several, there was a major pandemic, influenza pandemic in like 1957, 1958. I think another one in 1969, 1970. So, you can, I read some things about the sort of responses to those and the ways that they were managed, which obviously contrasted immensely with what's happened in the past couple of years, not necessarily because the severity was any less, but, simply because the mode of governance was quite distinct, right? And so, in theory, all of these kind of fall under the heading of biopolitics, but that doesn't necessarily tell us that much, right? So I think we need to, try to be a bit more fine-grained in terms of, because I think, one problem is that, those of us who are critical of the pandemic response, can fall back on this as a kind of, as a shorthand for the stuff we don't like, or the stuff that we think was disastrous and harmful, right? But, the term is a great deal broader than that in its implication, is what has been distinct about this set of developments. So I think it can be useful, particularly for thinking, and here's my main sort of way that I would sell it as a valuable concept is for thinking about the value of sort of life itself, right? And it's the sort of paramount place that it's taken up in, legitimating power. And so, I think this basic idea that it become, it's a mode of politics where the value of kind of caring for and tending to and managing life, becomes a sort of primary mode of legitimation. I think, there's something quite useful there, in both in the Foucault piece, I kind of explore some of the aspects of it that reveal, major political ways that's been deployed kind of even pre-COVID. So I think there's something there that's useful, but at the same time that, we have to also try to get more specific about the form that's taken recently.
No, absolutely. I think, I think that the question of bare life, and Agamben, I think, is right on this, it has come to the forefront because, it's quite obviously a legacy of, 3 decades of humanitarian politics, certainly on the kind of mainstream center liberal end of the spectrum, which was nakedly and in its early days self-consciously seen as an alternative to actual politics, as to contestation between left and right. And that contestation between left and right involved different visions of what the good life might be. And then in the absence of politics, you have humanitarianism, which flows in, initially applied to distant lands and vulnerable victims abroad, and has now been brought home. And that implies a politics, in quotation marks, which just seeks to preserve life in various ways. And I think you draw it out quite well in the discussion, for example, of like pro-life movements, anti-abortion movements, which are pro-life, but which that also, entails certain contradictions about, you can murder a doctor who carries out abortions, for example. And I guess what ends up being central to this is, or rather the kind of the obvious opposition to this would be some notion of what human flourishing could be. To put in maybe too grand terms, but of what the good life might be. And that might also require some form of biopolitics, and this was my issue, at least, with the use of the term, that some things that could be described by Foucauldians as biopolitics, I think would be the normal course of affairs for any kind of democratic politics, any socialist politics even, and that I think a certain element of that would be tolerated. And so to kind of have this hysterical reaction to all state authority, I mean, I'm not sure exactly where that politics leads, either to a despair that, oh no, we're constantly dominated everywhere, or maybe even an acceptance, as Bratton does, and goes, well, actually, no, let's double down on this, because it's a very radical move that Bratton does. And I think it's to be commended for it, because it's explicit about what it's trying to do, rather than just going, well, biopolitics is when the state does this thing that I don't like it to do, you know.
So what's your kind of conclusion there, that the opposite of biopolitics is also biopolitics, and so therefore it's not such a useful term because it describes the kind of preconditions for any politics? I'm not trying to caricature.
No. I'm not saying it's a precondition for politics. I'm just saying that it is one element. I mean, in terms of the state management of life, obviously, you know, a democratic, truly democratic authority would involve us all in decision making over both the bases of life as well as kind of bigger things that we want to achieve in life, But there will always be some element of kind of state response and a need to manage conflicts, I think, between people on questions of life. I don't see what
I guess my, you know, as you were talking, I don't think it is something we talked about so much in when we did this on the reading club, like what the opposite of biopolitics is. And it's like, well, I mean, the kind of the more crankish response that I sort of find myself leaning towards is like freedom. But is that a bit too easy? I mean, because it's a bit like, yeah, okay, so you're talking about the necessity of the state to manage populations and to deal with all sorts of more or less medicalized and kind of bodily phenomena of various sorts which lead to life. So yeah, I mean, that has to happen to a certain extent, and the alternative is death. I mean, this maybe is the kind of the implication or the assumption at the bottom of kind of maybe an approach like Bratton's, is like you either get with the biopolitics game or everybody dies. So it is a kind of ultimately politics of no alternative.
Let me just jump in a bit before I ask Geoff to come in to kind of, because I think the everybody dies thing is in a way a part of biopolitics as well, right? I mean, it is the state deciding over life and death. And this might not have happened in Britain, but it happens certainly on like the periphery of global capitalism, where there is a biopolitics there, and it often involves allowing people to die. And so
I choose
deciding
life,
the conditions.
not death.
So, well, yeah, I mean, you know, so it's not exactly an enviable choice that you want to be making. But my point is that they're both you know, aspects of biopolitics. Sorry, Geoff.
Yeah, no, I suppose, you know, for me, the thing that, okay, so, you know, we've seen, I mean, we've discussed Bratton's argument, you know, I think the other thing we see, I mean, I just like probably pointlessly, but that's what Twitter is, responded, you know, like replied to some tweet that, you know, by you know, New York leftist journalist that kind of just, you know, reiterated this point we've heard endlessly, right? Which is that, you know, these COVID was this opportunity to, you know, create this new mode of solidarity and bring about this kind of, you know, renovation of the social contract based on care for the other and all of this kind of stuff, right? And so, and based on, you know, care, demanding that the state, you know, care for the vulnerable and all that, right? So, I mean, the thing that, you know, my main line of criticism, I mean, I have various lines of criticism at this point, but maybe the one I've repeated most is that what we've seen at every point is that, you know, this idea of, you know, this proclaimed devotion to care for life and care for the vulnerable and so on, always has as its flip side this kind of scapegoating of, you know, the other who does not care, right? And this other who does not care is usually, you know, I mean, in a sort of a Agamben sense, becomes, you know, is treated as treated as a homo sacer, right? Is basically somebody who is pushed outside of the polis, right? This is the anti-vaxxer is probably the most obvious instance where you have this kind of notion of like an immunological commons or something like that, and they are outside of it, and therefore they are, you know, essentially consigned to oblivion, right? And so, this goes along, and again, just to sort of state my appreciation of certain parts of how Foucault defines this. I quote him in my article saying that within the sort of regime of biopolitics, one had the right to kill only those who represented a kind of biological danger to others, right? So this is kind of he has an account of how the justification for the death penalty essentially shifts, right? That, something he's interested in a lot of his work is how, societies evolve in terms of like under what conditions the state can kill, right? And so, essentially under biopolitics, the state kills by defining someone as a danger to life, right? And therefore the killing is itself a kind of, part of the project of biopolitical management, right? And so what we've seen is this happening a lot rhetorically, right? Where basically the people who are outside of this, who display this, this lack of concern in the form of refusing to, follow the science or whatever, are treated as a kind of expendable life and a life that it would be desirable, politically desirable to extinguish, basically. And so this, we've seen this just in a casual rhetorical way thrown around. And then more broadly, we've seen this idea that, and this kind of goes back to the state capacity point, right? That, those who are to blame for whatever the consequences of this virus are always, the other people who have failed to be obedient enough to the latest, CDC guidelines or mandates or whatever. So in other words, and this is also related to why I think there's a sort of deep connection with the broader trajectory of neoliberalism, right? Where there's basically treated as primarily responsible. Instead, blame is assigned horizontally to these scapegoats who are seen as the cause of the failed, management of the virus, right? And so, part of what this means is, of course, that the whole thing can, that there's no expectation. I mean, that in fact, no demands are being placed on state capacity, because anytime anything bad happens, a new surge of cases, it can always be blamed on these sort of, homo sacer figures who are seen as the actual, vectors of contagion, right? And also source of sort of danger to the body politic. So, that I think is, again, is specific to, we've seen other examples of this kind of politics in the years leading up to this, but I think it's, maybe the most kind of disastrous aspect of this whole response, and it does involve a kind of, in a way, sort of radicalization of certain, premises of biopolitics that Foucault identifies.
Yeah, no, just to kind of go back to this point you made earlier about emergency politics as a mode of legitimation for institutions. I think this is, it just got me thinking about the I guess, to bring in the kind of British case, there's an argument that we've, or point that we've discussed on this podcast quite a lot before, that if you move from a nation state, which is legitimated by some kind of representative mechanism that the, political elites or political representatives have some kind of vertical relationship with the citizenry, and then you move to a member state of the European Union, where that mode of legitimation or that kind of relationship becomes horizontal, i.e. political elites get their policy direction, get their kind of legitimacy of what they're doing from other European elites, then it seems like, in this, to take the case of Britain, no longer a member state, but not able to go back to that nation state, so this in this weird kind of limbo, it completely makes sense, or it completely, I think, resonates with my experience of being British, that is emergency politics. So COVID, Ukraine, that there is a kind of a flailing around for sources of legitimacy, given that previous vertical relationship of the nation state that's been eroded away, that previous horizontal relationship of the member state that doesn't pertain anymore. So it just seems like, not to put it too grandiosely, but we're kind of at the forefront of world history again, for the first time since 1640 in where I am, that it's like this state that's looking for legitimation, is kind of, emergency politics makes a great deal of sense to fill this gap. And we're the first post member state. That's I guess my conclusion. Anyway, I just wanted to, that was a rather long digression, but is this going to become what we see in the next sort of 20 years, that, because it does seem like we've had two once in a lifetime of things happening, COVID and then the restarting of history in Ukraine. I mean, are we just going to have these sorts of continual emergencies for the foreseeable future as the way that states try to legitimize themselves, do you think?
Yeah, that is sort of my sense. I mean, I'll come back here in terms of this competing emergency politics. It's interesting to me that this whole state of exception concept, as I argued in the second piece that Alex mentioned in the New Atlantis, it originates in this kind of Weimar era debate between a figure of the left, Walter Benjamin, and a figure of the right, Carl Schmitt, right, who are, in a way, sort of, each other's, thoughtful interlocutors, right, and kind of actually appreciate each other's work. But, what's curious is that actually both of them are, in a sense, kind of advocates of emergency politics. I mean, Schmitt, most obviously, right, because he really sees, he's an anti-liberal theorist, right, and he wants to push, he sees interwar liberalism as just, of the Weimar Republic as, in this kind of inexorable trajectory towards collapse. And so he sees the state of exception as a means by which a kind of new order can be installed. And that's effectively what happens in 1933. And he's essentially supportive and kind of useful of the Nazis. Meanwhile, Benjamin, himself later a victim of the Nazis, really, is using this to think in terms, in his very kind of, apocalyptic and sort of messianic mode of Marxism about, on one hand, he's thinking about, in a sense, he thinks of the sort of reign of capital as itself this kind of prolonged state of exception, which can only be suspended by a kind of exception within the exception, in a sense. So what's interesting is both of them are kind of using this concept to think positively, right? They're sort of positive theorists of the state of exception about how to transcend this kind of moribund liberal order that they were living in the interwar period. So it's interesting that when it kind of comes back to currency, basically through Agamben, it's deployed as a critical concept. It's heavily embraced by the left as a way of critiquing the war on terror in the Bush administration, and then it kind of goes away. Just as we forgot Foucault during the pandemic, we kind of forgot Agamben's critiques of the security state after Obama was elected, and everybody decided, him continuing all the stuff Bush was doing was fine. So basically, on one hand, my point is, on one hand, you have this positive emergency politics of the left and of the right, already kind of at the origin of the concept as it's deployed in modern times. And, the left version of that is, again, I think this, one or the other version of this positive biopolitics, or perhaps a kind of, climate emergency, way of transcending capitalism, this kind of war communism concepts that you get from Malm or, Zizek's various kind of deployments of similar ideas. And then on the right, you do have a real, and this is, again, where the kind of Trumpian intellectuals fit into this, right? Where, in a sense, they are really resurrecting this kind of Schmittian project, because the reason they're trying to overturn the election is not simply because they thought it was unfair or they thought Biden cheated. It's because they see it as a way of kind of overturning the sort of normal functioning of the system that will enable a kind of, again, an installation of a new regime, right? As they like to talk about it, like a sort of, the only way you can actually have a revolution in the regime is by, essentially deconstructing it administratively through some kind of radical action, right? And so they see that essentially breaks the rules as, that are accepted at a given moment, right? So in other words, they see the abnormality of something like, overturning this election as part of the point, right? Because the point is in fact to, weaponize a kind of state of emergency and a kind of exception, a kind of exceptional politics in order to overturn the regime.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, in terms of like this guy, John Eastman, I mean, Ross Douthat had a column about him recently that kind of tried to make sense of this. But, it is also, again, to the extent that the kind of Trumpian right that actually like is still trying to overturn election results in states, has a kind of ethos behind it. I mean, I don't think this is the way that the majority of like just average sort of MAGA people are thinking about it. It actually really is this explicit notion that you have to do something that, subverts the accepted norms of the time and thereby kind of creates this new state of exception by which a new regime can sort of be established.
So that in that piece in the New Atlantis, I mean, you make the point that opposing the state of exception, recent history suggests, can perpetuate it rather than helping us move beyond it. So, the emergence, raising the alarm bell of the emergency of COVIDian biopolitics, for example, itself is a participation in some way in emergency politics, which I find convincing, but I also kind of wondering what the alternative to that is. And it strikes me that what you've got now is a neoliberalism which is crumbling. It's almost unrecognizable, probably, if one were to compare it to its 1980s variant. And what you have, instead of either, kind of force from any part of society overthrowing neoliberalism, and, overthrowing neoliberalism doesn't need to mean social revolution in the way that, a socialist would want. I just mean some section, even a faction of the elite or from the middle class or whoever it might be, just kind of moving us on to a new sort of order. Instead of that, what you have is this competing emergency politics, which I think probably serves to freeze neoliberalism in place, while at the same time serving to kind of shift it into new ways. I mean, becoming, I don't know, increasing its control mechanisms, perhaps increasing the role of the state in not just in, perhaps in taking more direct responsibility for outcomes, right? In the sense of like, we're not just going to do, for example, to take the example of the preferred left-wing emergency politics around the climate, we're not just going to do carbon trading, i.e. the classic neoliberal response of creating a market where one didn't exist, but we're going to to take more direct action to ban people from driving cars or whatever it might be. And so that might shift us past neoliberalism, but without really any serious challenge of its fundamentals, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so, going back to your earlier point, right? So the argument I make there, I mean, in a way it was partly conceived in part as a kind of self-critique, because I think my own, particularly like living in New York, which, I mean, at this point has relaxed a lot of the COVID policies, but still has a couple of particularly insane and sort of sadistic ones in place. So I was finding my own outrage against what I saw as the disastrous sort of governance during this period, made me just, first of all, forget about any other issues. Just as the people I was arguing with, had forgotten about everything other than COVID, I did as well, but I mostly forgot about everything other than, being angry about stupid COVID policies. And so, I think it does kind of create this, mimetic effect where, when you're sort of, I mean, and I think this goes back to like a simple point you brought up about, state capacity, right? That like, I mean, part of what we're, and this is a very kind of American affairs point, I suppose, but like, part of what we're lacking is like a sort of, various kinds of project, sort of positive kind of developmentalist projects in a sense, right? That will, rebuild various kinds of state capacity.
Yeah.
Rebuild, various kinds of, production that, were, I mean, the absence of which was very evident early on in the pandemic and, kind of still is with the supply chain snags and, results and the impact on inflation. So, I do think there is a kind of, a way that these kind of competing states of state of emergency politics are necessarily going to be inimical to those kinds of projects, right? Which are, it's not to say that those kind of, I think those kind of projects historically actually have often come about in response to various kinds of emergencies, interestingly. But, at the moment, that doesn't seem to be the type of demand that, these types of emergencies are occasioning, or the kind of politics that's developing out of a kind of, exceptionality type of thinking. So, and this could relate also to the, episode I did on my podcast recently about the sort of theorizing the culture war with Michael Cuenca, where I think, the things he's thinking about as this, the sources of a kind of debilitating culture war, are at odds with any of these kind of more ambitious projects that are really taking root. So, I think there is a kind of, and the argument I also made an example I gave of how we saw this happen is that, this whole kind of state of exception thinking was really a critique of the American security state and the original form it took in Agamben's kind of reception in American academia, 15, 20 years ago. And then, again, what we saw basically was the left, first of all, embrace the agencies of the security state as its allies. And also, and this is kind of interesting in relation to where sovereignty lies, who can declare the state of exception? Well, it seems clear to me that, it was the left that declared the state of exception during the Trump presidency, right? Yeah. And it was able to do that in a way that was efficacious because of its alliances and positioning within various of these institutions, right? Which I think, supports some sort of notion of sovereignty being located in this kind of managerial system. And the relative fecklessness, and this kind of relates back to the point about, Trump in Bratton's argument, being representing a kind of reassertion of the kind of older politics of sovereignty, his relative kind of fecklessness and even helplessness against these kind of onslaughts, again, is a good illustration of that. So I don't know how well that answered your question. I think
no, I think that's I think that's right. But I think I wanted to carry on and go into the question of culture wars, because I think that it intersects in an interesting way potentially with the kind of competing emergency politics. But we've been going for over an hour, and unfortunately we're going to have to end here. But if you're up for coming on the podcast again in the near future to do a discussion on culture wars, we should do that. Sure. And in any case, I think the kind of thing that strikes us about the competing emergency politics, which I think we agree on, that it's something that characterizes contemporary politics, isn't going away anytime soon. So there's plenty of times to explore its contours more. Try to actually get a grip.
There's no emergency to have.
No, right, exactly. Exactly. There's no emergency. Why don't you just stop and think? Don't just do something. Stand there. I think that's a good takeaway. All right, Geoff. Thanks very much for coming on, and we'll have to have you on again soon.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks so much.
Excellent.